If you've ever been treated like a tool instead of a person, measured only by what you could do, not who you are, then this story was written for you. If you've ever been pushed so far that silence became your weapon, you'll understand why she didn't aim to kill. She aimed to make them feel. I wasn't supposed to know his name. That was the first rule of the Soul Ammo program. Anonymity. You don't name a bullet. You don't touch it longer than necessary. You don't wonder what they looked like, who they left behind, or how they died before you chambered them. You load, you aim, you fire. That's it. And yet, I knew. The casing was smooth, just like the others. Silver alloy with a blue rune scarring one side, humming with residual pain. But someone had carved initials, small, defiant, almost childlike in their crookedness. TAS. 3 letters that should have meant nothing. 3 letters that should have been wiped away in the cleansing chamber. But they weren't. They lingered, like they were waiting for me. And I couldn't look away. It should have earned a court-martial. Personalizing a soul cartridge was classified as high treason under the Ashbourne Code. But nobody saw. Not the cleric who passed it to me with sterile fingers. Not the captain who barked my assignment like he was ordering a sandwich. Only me. And in that moment, something shifted. They trained us in Sector 9. Nothing warm survived there. The barracks were concrete slabs, the lights cold and blue like glacier eyes. We slept on thin mats, woke to chimes, recited our vows into gray air. We were taught to think of ourselves as tools, extensions of command, human triggers. The bonding ceremony was supposed to strip us of ego. They didn't call it a pairing, they called it calibration. They drew a rune on my spine and pressed a soul well to my chest. I remember the cold, not physical cold, soul cold, like some part of me had been unplugged from everything human, like my name didn't belong to me anymore. They said the link would be clean, efficient, emotionless. They lied. My first shot should have been simple. A recon breach, far from the front lines. I crouched in the kill hollow, snow pressed into the knees of my standard-issue uniform, the rifle humming against my palms. My breath fogged the scope. The cartridge slid into place with a mechanical click. That should have been it. But the moment the casing locked, something bled through. Not words, not panic, just an image. A violin. Fractured bow, splintered wood, strings frayed like nerves. No context, no sound, just that silent grief, like memory cut from someone else's bone and stitched into mine. Then the command came. Clear. I fired. And he shattered. The feedback didn't hit like they said it would. It wasn't just a pulse. It was a scream, not in my ears, but in the bend of my spine. It was heat behind my eyes and acid in my ribs. It wasn't death I felt. It was everything right before it. I collapsed backward. My fingers locked around the grip. My jaw refused to unclench. And when I got back to base, I couldn't sleep. My hands trembled for 3 nights. I told no one. I tucked them under my mat, curled my fingers into fists, and tried to pretend the memory of the violin wasn't vibrating inside my teeth. I thought the shaking would get me discharged, but it didn't. They called it adrenaline bleed. Normal for first-timers, said the med tech. She'll acclimate. They were half right. I stopped trembling, but I never acclimated. I adapted. They started calling me precise, efficient. My shots were clean, no second pulls, no misfires. On paper, I was an asset. In their eyes, I was a model soldier. But they didn't understand. My precision wasn't from obedience. It was from pattern recognition. Pain has a rhythm, a frequency. Every soul I bonded with had a distinct echo, some sharp like a knife twist, others dull like rain against glass. Some left colors, some left songs. One boy showed me his dog over and over again, like he thought if I saw it enough times, I wouldn't fire. I did. They say you get used to it. But you don't. You learn to file it, to tuck it into corners of your body where the commanders can't see. My memories weren't mine anymore. They belonged to the boys and girls I turned into smoke. Their whispers folded into me like gunpowder folded into cloth. And then the signs began. It was small things at first. Scars where they shouldn't be, burn lines trailing the spines of corpses that never saw fire. Sigils etched over older sigils, like the soul had been bonded twice. That was impossible. The clerics said is were sacred, singular, final. But I saw too many bodies that told a different story. Then came the reassignments. Ammo units I'd been told were expended started showing up again in new chambers. I knew their echoes. I recognized the tremble they left in my joints. But the brass insisted I was wrong. Too many missions, they said. You're imagining it. But I wasn't. Something was wrong under the skin of the system. Something they were repurposing, recycling. And somehow, no one cared. They had all adapted too well. I think that's when the fracture started. Not with the first shot, or the trembling, or the violin memory that still played in my dreams, but with the realization that I was the only one who still heard anything at all. Everyone else was deaf, willfully, comfortably. That made me dangerous. So I kept quiet. I sharpened my shots. I smiled when they praised me. I let them call me elite, a prime operator. But deep inside, I cataloged everything, the names, the anomalies, the errors in the runes, the way one of the clerics sometimes wiped blood off the sigil stone when he thought no one was watching. I never asked what the TAS stood for, but I held on to those initials like they were an answer I didn't know I needed. Because I had a theory. If a soul could bleed through a casing, maybe it could bleed back. They told us to load, aim, fire. But no one told us what to do with the pieces that stayed inside you. And I had far too many pieces now. Enough to make something sharp. Something that could cut back. Base Oris smelled like scorched metal and prayer oil, sweet and acrid, like something wholly gone wrong. It was quiet here, too quiet, as if even the air was under surveillance. No shouting, no footfalls louder than permitted. The kind of silence that wasn't about discipline, but about control. I felt it in my teeth the moment I stepped off the transport. This wasn't a base. It was a shrine, and we were the clergy of sanctioned violence. They called it an honor being stationed at Oris, said it meant you'd been trusted, that your soul readings showed exceptional calibration. I didn't correct them. I never corrected them. Let them think it was discipline, not obsession. Let them believe I earned my station because I was whole, not because I was already splintered and I knew how to hide the cracks. The first briefing lasted 7 hours. Runes, logistics, classified language wrapped in gold thread warnings. But there was one name, one number, that slipped from the lips of the briefing officer with just enough tremor to make my spine pay attention. Asset 442, Class Alpha. Do not speak unless prompted. Do not initiate psychic contact. Do not refer to him by his birth name under any circumstance. But someone had already whispered it. Tobias Ashbourne. I didn't even have to ask. The room reacted like a body under shock, muscles tightening, posture adjusting. The general's son, the architect's heir, the living proof that even gods send their children into the trenches, just not to fight, to stand there while others pull the trigger. No one said it aloud, but we all thought it. If the doctrine could devour bloodlines, then it could devour anyone. Officially, Tobias had volunteered. That's what the brass claimed. A willing sacrifice, the document said. But sacrifice wasn't the word that came to mind when I first saw him in the calibration chamber. He sat like a shadow might, press, head thin and long against the corner of the rune-lit room, eyes half-lidded like he was somewhere else entirely. Not drugged, not broken, just resigned. And that terrified me more than anything. I'd seen rage, panic, even hope once, but acceptance? That was a different kind of rot. He was pale, almost too pale for someone raised in the southern sectors. His hair was a mess of dark curls that looked like they hadn't been combed in weeks. There was a smudge of dried blood beneath his left eye, a burn mark above his collarbone, and worst of all, etched across the inside of his left wrist, just barely visible under the binding cuff. A violin. Not literal, no. A faded ink tattoo. A bow curving around a hollow body, strings curling into the veins beneath. Fragile, deliberate, familiar. I couldn't look away, not until the technician nudged me forward and said, "Unit 17, step into the pairing circle." That was me. I stepped forward, one foot in the chalk, one on the steel. I felt the air change. The chamber's glyphs hummed. Tobias didn't move, not even as the soul link activated and the bond stretched between us like a string drawn taut. Then, contact. And the scream hit me. It wasn't sound. It wasn't even pain. It was recognition, like something ancient and sharp had been waiting in the dark, and the moment we touched, it finally had a voice. Shame, regret, the taste of iron, 1,000 I'm sorries that had no place to land, and behind all of it, the violin again. This time, it was burning. I stumbled back, hand pressed to my ribs, lungs refusing to work. The technicians wrote it down. Oversensitivity, they muttered. Phase destabilization. But no one questioned the bond. They couldn't. Class alphas were supposed to be blank, voids, perfect energy, no feedback. And yet, Tobias had screamed. Inside his chest, inside mine, he had flinched. He had bled. That night, I hacked the registry. I'd done it before. Quiet things, simple reroutes, testing how easy it was to reshuffle assignments. No one ever noticed. They thought the divine clerics ran the matching system. They didn't realize it was code, data, just ones and zeros dressed in myth. This time, I went deeper. I traced every bond chamber linked to Asset 442. 96 pairings, 87 casualties. Each chamber logged under different operators, different regions, different excuses. But all of them shared one anomaly: etched initials. On casing, on grips. Even inside the barrel housing of one elite model rifle, TAS. It wasn't rebellion, it was a signature. Tobias wasn't silent because he was submissive. He was silent because he was haunted. Because every bond left a mark, and the system kept reassigning him, wiping him, repurposing him over and over and over. They didn't see him as a person anymore. He was a battery video with legacy blood. And I couldn't stop thinking about the violin. The first boy I ever fired sent me that image, the soundless cry of something beautiful turned useless. And now I'd seen it tattooed on Tobias's skin, buried like a secret he'd never meant to share. Coincidence doesn't happen in war, only repetition. I didn't flinch anymore. I hadn't in years, but he did, and that was enough. I had already memorized the soul bond encryption tables, already mapped the back doors they'd forgotten to close. It was easy, really. Like all systems built on arrogance, they never assumed anyone would dare to rewrite it. They wanted me to believe even the general's son bled like the rest of us. But Tobias didn't bleed. He withered. And I wanted to know why. They said the algorithm was divine, that pairings were chosen by holy sigil, by ancient scripture interpreted through modern code. But I had already peeled the scripture apart and found the gears underneath, lines of logic, commands written by men with god complexes and passwords as brittle as ash. Reprogramming the soul link wasn't even the hard part. The hard part was doing it in silence, masking the signatures, rerouting the sync pathways, hiding the traces of my digital fingerprints behind cleric override codes. It took exactly 13 minutes. 13 minutes to sentence a boy to bleed every time I lifted my rifle. I didn't do it because I hated him. I did it because he flinched. Because his silence had screamed. Because his soul had touched mine and I saw what the program had made of him. Something worn thin, stretched like thread across too many bonds, too many chambers, too many necessary casualties. And now, every time his essence was fired through a barrel, it took something else from him. A nerve, a breath, a sound he'd never get back. And still, the machine kept loading him again and again. So I rewired the feed. From now on, he would only link to me. No matter what gun, no matter what base, just me. They wouldn't notice, not at first. No one questioned system errors at Oris. They were called anomalies, divine misfire, rune fatigue. It gave them an excuse to ignore what was broken and keep using it until it collapsed. I didn't collapse. He did. The next mission came in quietly. No ceremony, just a data packet labeled Cleansing Protocol 3A, Civil Unrest in the Agricultural Sectors, Farmers, Widows, Draft Dodgers. They were tired of conscription, tired of soul taxes, tired of losing their children to the doctrine that demanded bodies for bullets. The brass wanted surgical precision. No firebombs, no mass graves, just disappearances, just silence. They called us peacekeepers. I kissed the barrel of my rifle as I loaded the first round. Ritual now. Reverent. Inside the chamber, faint beneath the alloy. T.S. I could feel him already, before I even lifted the stock to my shoulder. His pulse beat under my fingernails. His breath stuttered against my cheek like ghost wind. I chambered the round. The feedback thread tugged at my chest like a leash made of guilt and heat. The first shot was supposed to hit a flag bearer. I missed. Clipped the watchtower instead. Let it rain sparks and panic. The crowd screamed. Scatter pattern initiated. That bought me time. Room to breathe. Room to feel. I chambered again. And this time, I didn't miss. The round lanced through the air and struck a rebel's shoulder cleanly. Precision. Silence. No sound escaped him but a grunt as he folded. But behind my eyes, Tobias convulsed. The psychic link flared. My fingers twitched. I could feel him jerk sideways in whatever padded room they locked him in. I could taste blood on my tongue. Not mine, not his. Ours. His heartbeat collided with mine like an offbeat drum. I fired again. Another hit. Another tremor. Not in me. In him. It started subtle. That's always how breakdowns begin. The soul doesn't explode all at once. It frays. Field medics whispered behind clipboards, unsure how Asset 442, supposedly stable, blank, purified, was suddenly exhibiting back feedback. His hands began twitching during diagnostics. He winced at certain frequencies. He flinched when clerics stepped too close, even if they hadn't activated a bond. They tried to recalibrate him. They burned incense, re-inked his glyphs, blamed the last operator for improper mental hygiene. But it wasn't operator error. It was by design. My design. Every bullet I fired carried him closer to something forbidden. Feeling. Not death, not pain, but awareness. Every time I shot, I imagined the violin vibrating in his ribcage, strings snapping one by one. That wasn't cruelty, that was liberation, because if he could feel, he could choose, and if he could choose, he could break. The general didn't speak of it. High Marshal Severin Ashbourne was a man made of stone and silence. But he knew. The mask cracked when he visited Oris and saw Tobias slumped against a corridor wall, breathing too fast, flinching from light like it burned. He didn't ask for a report. He didn't need to. Instead, he called a lockdown, sealed the logs, cleared the staff. Asset 442 was placed under spiritual quarantine, whatever that meant. In truth, they stuffed Tobias in a quiet room, injected him with psychic stabilizers, and prayed no one noticed the general's air had turned into a trembling symbol of system failure. But I noticed. Because I felt it too. And I wasn't trembling anymore. I cleaned my weapon slower that night. My hands moved with ritual grace, fingers ghosting over the shell of the gun like I was touching a living thing. In a way, I was. He was inside every chamber now. Every round hummed with Tobias's residual echo. A pulse, a prayer, a protest. And I whispered to him between shots. "You still in there?" Silence. "Then keep listening." They tried to reassign me the next day, said I'd be cycling into drone ops. Less soul exposure, more efficiency, less noise. I nodded, smiled, walked out of the logistics tent and doubled back through the back channel I'd etched into the registry weeks ago. I rerouted the pairing again. Tobias was still mine. They'd have to burn the system to stop me now. I wasn't trying to kill him. I was making him feel. Every damn trigger pull was a funeral march through his bones. This time, I wasn't the weapon. I was the conductor, and I was just beginning the overture. They tried to hide it at first. They always do. But silence doesn't mask suffering. It amplifies it. By the second week, everyone on base Oris knew something was wrong with Asset 442. Not because of a leak, not because of reports, but because Tobias Ashbourne began to shiver. In public, during drills, in the halls, in front of witnesses who had been trained to ignore pain unless it came with a kill count. The flinches started first, then the nosebleeds, then the night tremors that rattled his cot against the walls loud enough for the entire wing to hear. Some said he was seizing, others whispered he was possessed. One cleric crossed himself whenever Tobias passed, muttering a ward against tainted bonds, but I knew the truth. It wasn't possession. It was connection. And he was finally feeling every ounce of it. Every pull of the trigger, every drop of recoil, every psychic splinter I sent into bone and memory. My hands never shook anymore. But Tobias's? They trembled constantly, like he was holding something too heavy and too holy to drop. The general claimed it was neural overstrain, blamed fatigue, climate fluctuations, latent infections. Ordered double silence across all staff. No one was to mention the feedback failure. Any technician caught logging anomalies without direct order was reassigned or demoted. 3 medics disappeared in a week. Tobias didn't speak. Not because he couldn't, because if he did, the whole doctrine would unravel. He was the cornerstone of their propaganda. Sacrifice, legacy, control. If people knew the general's son was cracking under the same system he authored, they'd start to wonder what it meant that someone so sacred could suffer, so they wrapped him tighter, and still, he twitched. The final straw wasn't a collapse. It was a sound. Static. Faint. Like a broken radio signal bleeding out from beneath his skin. It started in the barracks during an inspection. He doubled over, hands clutching his temples, and a warbling tone, high, broken, metallic, echoed from his throat like a haunted broadcast. The clerics called for a cleansing. They burned sage, etched over his sigils in thick red ink, submerged him in medicated salt water. He came out colder, paler, but no quieter. Because now, everyone could hear it. He didn't cry with tears. He cried in static. And that's when command called for me. The room they put me in wasn't built for confession. It wasn't dim or quiet or theatrical like the old stories say. It was fluorescent, soulless, and lined with cameras that blinked like insects. 2 officers, 1 cleric, and a lieutenant who didn't say a word until the others left. You hacked the registry. Not a question, a certainty. I leaned back in the chair. Yes. You rerouted the pairing threads. Yes. You bound Asset 442 to your personal rotation permanently. Yes. You corrupted the bond. I smiled, calm, centered, unflinching. No. The lieutenant blinked. No? I didn't corrupt it, I said, voice steady. I perfected it. He stared at me for a moment longer than protocol allowed. He's breaking. I know. You're torturing the general's son. No, I'm reminding him he has a body. They wanted to punish me. But the problem with using divine systems to justify warfare is that when someone plays by those same rules better than you can't admit they cheated. You can only admit they saw the truth. So they didn't execute me. That would make me a martyr. They demoted me, dish unit, where souls go to rot. The dish unit wasn't a station. It was a punishment. Chemical waste disposal, battery scrubbing, sigil residue removal. The lowest rung of the base, where failed units, defunct cartridges, and burned-out bonders were sent to decay in silence. I cleaned walls stained with grief, hauled buckets filled with discarded soul fluid, scrubbed rune plates until my fingers blistered under thick gloves. But nothing stung worse than the silence they forced on me, except he wasn't silent. Not Tobias. Even down there, even 3 floors beneath the command deck, I felt him. When he flinched, my jaw ached. When he screamed, silently, across the tether, I tasted copper and violin strings behind my eyes. The link hadn't broken. They didn't know how to break it. A soul bond, once blooded in fire and pain, clung like roots to bone. They could scrub my name off the mission boards, but they couldn't erase the resonance. I started writing his name on the wall. TAs. Every day, after rounds, I etched it into the rusted paneling beside my bunk. Over and over, like a prayer made of defiance. No one asked what it meant. Maybe they didn't dare. He used to be a symbol. Now he was a warning, and they hated me for making him human. They reassigned him again, tried to match him to another operator. I saw it happen in the system's reflection, even from below. New links failed instantly, bonds short-circuited, cartridges refused to fire. The moment another soldier touched his echo, they vomited blood or dropped screaming, because he was already occupied. He belonged to me. That night, I dreamed in static. It wrapped around my ribs like a symphony written in broken frequencies. And just before I woke, I saw him, Tobias, standing in the center of a burnt rune chamber, his hands raised and his mouth finally open. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His eyes were wide and awake. The tremors had stopped, and that terrified them more than the screams ever did. Because if he'd stopped shaking, it meant he'd started thinking. And that was the real threat. They didn't call it exile. The word was too old, too dramatic, too human. They called it reassignment, sanctioned reclassification, non-critical duty. But I knew the truth. I was being buried, not killed, just placed in a hole deep enough to be forgotten. I worked alone now, lower decks, dead hall, ways. The dish unit was mostly automated. What wasn't was left to ghosts like me. People they couldn't risk releasing but didn't have the spine to destroy. I wore gloves slick with discharge fluid. I stood over soul casings so empty they hummed with silence. No names, no pain, just the metallic smell of what used to be someone. And yet, I wasn't alone. Tobias stayed with me. Not physically, not even psychically in the way they once measured. It was subtler now, a tether buried under scar and muscle, like a violin string plucked once and still vibrating in my bones. At night I would lie flat on the steel bunk and close my eyes, and I could hear him, not with sound, but with sensation. His breath moving jaggedly through a throat not used to crying, his fingers twitching like he couldn't remember what they used to hold. And worst of all, the stillness in his chest. That, more than anything, told me the system had failed. Because even while they paraded him like a trophy, like proof that their doctrine still worked, I saw the flinch. They dressed him in ceremonial blacks, gilded cuffs, sigils redrawn over the burns they never let heal. He stood behind his father during addresses to the inner council, silent, obedient, polished like a statue. But statues don't shift when you speak their name. They don't pull back when you get too close. They don't cast eyes to the floor when the man beside them calls them proof of divine order. But Tobias did. He flinched when High Marshal Ashbourne raised his voice. He winced at sudden light. He blinked too often, like he was trying to dislodge something crawling behind his eyes. And the general? He never looked at him. Not really, not directly, as if acknowledging what Tobias had become might reflect something back he wasn't ready to see. Not his son, just his echo. The file came folded between chemical manifestos, slipped into my cleaning cart by someone who moved like breath and disappeared before I could turn. No signature, just a seal I'd seen once before, back when I still had clearance. The first page hit like ice. Echo frequency unregulated. Subject reports hallucinations. Primary repetition, string instruments. Subject requests silence during scans. Bond origin, 17X. Unauthorized but persistent. Attempts to sever have failed. Subject remains occupied. I didn't breathe for the first few paragraphs. I just read. The violin again. He was hearing it now. Not just projecting, not just bleeding through casing resonance. He was remembering something that didn't belong to him. Or maybe it did. Maybe it always had. Maybe that first soul, the one who sent me the image of the splintered violin, wasn't random. Maybe the system had recycled the pain so many times it had circled back into Tobias's veins. The file called it feedback saturation. I called it Emery. They didn't design bonds to last this long. The ritual was meant to be short, surgical, one soul, one shot. Then purge, reassign, repeat. But no one had ever held on to a link through trauma, corruption, command override, and reassignment. Until us. They thought they were building weapons. But bonds leave fingerprints, not just on skin, but on soul. They cling, stitch themselves into your marrow. Tobias wasn't a weapon anymore. He was a map of everything the system had tried to erase. And I was still holding the compass. I went back to writing his name. TAS. Over and over in the shadows of the waste corridor, where no surveillance dared peek and no officer wasted breath. I scratched it into metal grates with a broken scalpel. I whispered it into air ducts. I drew it in soap residue across glass. Not for him. For me. To remind myself the bond still pulsed. That no matter how many files they locked or rituals they cast, he was still tethered to me. To the first memory. To the pain they thought they had control over. And I began planning again. Not loudly. Not recklessly. Just like before. Inside the silence. Every system has a hole. Every doctrine forgets something. A back door, a protocol, a blind spot buried in arrogance. I had time, I had motive, and now I had leverage. They wanted to erase me. But every time they loaded a cartridge, I felt the ripple. Tobias never fired again after our bond, but they still tried to use him. As signal relay, as conduit, as psychic fuel. And every time, he sent static. Beautiful, broken, resistant static. I dreamed of him often now. In the dream, he stood at the center of a field of shells, all humming with remembered agony. He held the violin in one hand, burned, blackened, still somehow whole, and when he raised it, the bow became a blade. He didn't speak. He just looked at me like he knew what came next. I woke with blood on my lip from biting down too hard. But I didn't feel pain. Only clarity. They taught us bonds were weapons. They never imagined one could become a memory. And they never imagined that memory could aim back. They called it Operation Purity. Like blood could be filtered. Like souls could be laundered clean with just the right doctrine and a firing squad made of silence. It came with no ceremony, no public directive, just encrypted orders whispered between brass and burned into the stone walls of Oris like a threat that didn't need words. A covert strike against fractured loyalties within the command itself, officers questioning the bond program, techs who logged too much, clerics who prayed too little. There were no trials. Just assignments, just targets. And me. They reinstated me without warning. One morning, I was cleaning sludge from old runes. Next, I was handed a uniform, a new ID chip, and a mission docket sealed with black wax. No apology, no debrief, just a name I didn't recognize and a whisper I did. Report to Barrack. East Theta, you've been cleared for Field Tier 3, no questions. Of course I didn't ask any. Let them think I'd forgotten how to use my voice. Let them think I'd spent too long underground to still be dangerous. Let them think that anonymity meant loyalty. They dressed me in slate gray this time, cleaner than my old uniform, sharper lines, no insignia. Just another ghost with a gun. My new name, Operator E5K2. Cold, untraceable, perfect. But they forgot something. They never wiped my weapon log, and they never, ever checked the chamber. I found my old rifle waiting in the quartermaster's crate, stripped, reassembled, sterilized, but still mine. My hands curled around it like muscle memory had been waiting this entire time to come home. The casing clicked open with a soft hiss, and there it was, etched faintly in the alloy curve inside the soul chamber, just below the reload port. where no eyes ever bothered to look. TAS. I stared at it for a long time, not because I doubted it, but because I needed to feel it again. That small rebellion, that truth carved into silence. Tobias Ashbourne, still with me. Even now, even here. I slid the casing shut and locked it in place. The mission brief was crisp, clinical. A list of names, faces, locations, all internal threats, all people who'd once believed in the system and now dared to question it. We were told to neutralize with precision. No collateral. No soul signatures. No log trails. No aftershocks. And absolutely no psychic residue. They said it like it was law. I took it as an invitation. They deployed us through underground lifts beneath the assembly hall. I shared the ride with 4 other operators, faces masked, eyes vacant. One of them whispered a prayer before the lights dimmed. Another kept tapping his temple like he was trying to chase off the ghost of a thought. I didn't speak, but I counted my breaths, each one a metronome, each one a promise. We emerged beneath Command Spire Alpha, 5 clicks from the main base. The wind howled like it was angry to see us. The terrain ahead was sharp, jagged, just like the doctrine we served. A place of hidden bunkers and covered lies. Somewhere within that ground, truth was buried. And someone had decided it was time to salt the soil. Our orders were clear: sweep, eliminate, vanish. But my rifle had other plans. So did I. We split up by zones. I was assigned the outer perimeter, the power relay towers, and the uplink node. A low-tier sweep, supposedly. But I knew what was nearby. I'd studied these schematics once during long nights in exile, tracing the wires of the Empire back to their pulse. And I knew exactly who stood behind the uplink vault's reinforced walls. High Marshal Ashbourne, briefing his commanders, securing his grip, laying out what comes next. The wind bit at my skin as I knelt behind the hill crest, rifle poised, breath steady. The echo flared beneath my ribs, sharp, electric, certain. He was awake. Tobias. I didn't know where they'd taken him. I didn't know what room, what city, what base. But distance didn't matter when you were carved into someone's bone. I chambered the round and whispered down the bond. Just this once. Let me aim for both of us. The targeting scope swept across the tower grid, past the drones, past the thermal cloaks, and stopped. On him. Severin Ashbourne. Still standing tall, still untouched, still unrepentant. I imagined his voice, cold, efficient, the same tone he used in the recruitment vids. Pain purifies, bonds sanctify. The future bleeds for our salvation. I'd heard it enough times to recite it in my sleep. But not this time. This time I spoke first. They wanted silence, I murmured, fingers curling around the trigger. So I loaded their silence with his name. My thumb brushed the etching. TAS, and I pulled the trigger. The sound was clean, controlled. The recoil slid down my spine like a whisper of justice. And somewhere, distant but clear, Tobias gasped. Not in pain, in recognition. I didn't wait for the alarms. I didn't wait for confirmation. I just moved. Past the bodies, past the tower, past the myth. Because I hadn't come to kill a man. I'd come to unwrite a system. This is the recoil of loyalty. Not to flags, not to fathers, but to memory. To the one thing they couldn't sever. They will come for me now. I know that. But what they don't know is I'm already gone. Already echo. Already aimed again. There is a violence colder than rage. Not explosive, not loud, not messy, but clinical, precise. The kind of violence that doesn't aim to kill. It aims to make them live with it. I lay flat on the rooftop of Command Spire Alpha, shadowed by old antenna beams, my rifle cradled against my shoulder like a prayer made of steel. Below me, the The world ticked in measured authority. Drone towers rotated with practiced grace, soldiers moved in geometric lines, and at the center of it all, under a pale war banner bearing the sigil of the doctrine, stood High Marshal Severin Ashbourne. He spoke without a mic. He never needed amplification. His voice was ritual, burned into every corner of this war. His hands moved as he addressed his men, sharp, theatrical, not one gesture wasted. I'd once seen those hands sign the orders that turned civilians into soul ammo. Now I wondered how steady they'd be once they shook. I adjusted the scope. Not at his head, not yet. That would be too fast, too clean. And I didn't come here for mercy. I came to unmake a legacy. I chambered the first round. The feedback licked across my palm, warm, pulsing. Tobias's echo, still tethered, still burning. I whispered to the bond, even though I knew he couldn't hear me, not with ears. "You'll feel this one." Then I fired. The first shot struck the northeast drone tower, cracking the stabilizer core. It hissed, then roared, bursting upward in a column of orange light. Soldiers scattered, sirens screamed, and in the center of it all, Severin looked up. Just once. Just enough. I chambered the second round. My finger trembled, not from fear, from anticipation. The feedback thread tightened like a violin string inside my spine. Tobias twitched. A whimper, not imagined this time, but real. Audible. Somewhere on the base, someone screamed through clenched teeth. A medical officer barked orders. But it wasn't a soldier who'd been shot. It was a weapon that had remembered how to hurt back. I fired again. The fuel tanks ignited like struck nerves. Flames spilled into the sky, catching the edges of the comms relay. The earth shook. Static poured from every speaker in the courtyard below, garbled and chaotic. And Tobias screamed. Not inside my head this time. Not tucked behind bone. I heard it echo through the walls, bouncing through every frequency, like a siren coded in pain. I felt his knees hit the floor. I felt the shudder in his lungs. And I didn't stop. Because this was never just about retribution. It was about translation. About forcing the untouchable to finally speak the only language they denied ever existed, suffering. The next round struck the auxiliary command grid. Sparks rained down on the main podium, cutting out every light in the quadrant. Officers scrambled. Engines failed. The doctrine seal behind Severin glitched mid-symbol, breaking into two fractured halves. He stared into the chaos, lips parted. But no orders came. Because what do you command when your empire speaks back in static? What do you say when your perfect weapon refuses to be silent? I loaded the final round. And for a moment, everything slowed. I remembered his voice, Tobias's, before it was stripped and filtered and smoothed into obedience. Just a boy's voice, shy, soft, asking if I played music. I hadn't answered then, so I did now. With one final breath, I lined up the shot. Not at Severin's chest, not at his head, but at the relay tower beside him, the one that fed his commands to the outer bases, the one that made his lies global. I pulled the trigger, and the world ruptured. The shockwave hit the ground like thunder pulled from bone. The podium cracked. The tower snapped sideways, steel screaming as it crashed down. Severin stumbled. And then he knelt, knees to stone, hands outstretched. And behind him, Tobias's scream broke into a sob. I felt it in my throat, in my wrists, in the ribs that had learned too well how to contain echo after echo after echo. This time, it broke free. I didn't kill the general. That would have been too easy, too quick. I made him grieve a war he never bled in. I made him kneel in the ashes of his own script, and I let his son's agony ride his spine like a ghost that wouldn't let go. By the time security reached the tower, I was already gone. Smoke swallowed my silhouette. Sirens wailed. People shouted over the comms, but no one dared call my name. because I had no name now. Only a bond, and memory, and vengeance. They'll call it sabotage, an act of madness. They'll bury Tobias again, patch the cracks, rewrite the logs. But it won't work, because something woke up inside him today. And now, every time the general speaks, he'll feel the recoil. They didn't execute me. That was the first thing that told me I'd won. They dragged me in, hands zip-locked behind my back, boots scuffing across polished stone, and locked me in a white room so clean it felt like bone. No questions, no chains, no violence, just silence, smooth and humming, like the aftermath of a detonation no one wants to name. I wasn't restrained. I wasn't tortured. I was held, like an idea they didn't know how to carry, one they couldn't discard without breaking their own script. A soldier who obeyed the protocols too well, who used every tool they gave her exactly as designed. They didn't know what to do with me because I hadn't broken the rules. I'd followed them home. They fed me twice a day, let me shower, gave me blank paper with no pen, thought they were stripping me of power. But power isn't in what you're given, it's in what you carry. And I carried him. Tobias. I heard his name once, whispered by a medic in the hallway. He's humming again. They'd moved him to Recovery Sector Omega, some secluded corner of the war where damaged assets went to either heal or disappear. His reports didn't show up on the network anymore. They'd locked his files behind triple clerical access, but I didn't need documentation. I felt him in the rhythm of the air vents, in the vibration of my bones at night when I closed my eyes, in the way the fluorescent lights flickered once, just once, every time someone said the word recalibration. They tried to unlink us. Of course they did. Clerics were brought in, summoned with ritual robes and trembling mouths. They carved new sigils, poured ink mixed with sedative blood, whispered prayers in forgotten tongues. The room stank of old belief and desperation. I sat in the center, watching as they etched symbols into the air, into the floor, into their own palms. They touched my back. The bond burned. One screamed, another seized. I didn't move, because the tether didn't lie in ink. It was written in pain, and pain leaves fingerprints deeper than any doctrine can erase. They brought in confessionals next, an old priest who smelled of iron and rot, reciting mantras that hadn't held power in decades. "Release what isn't yours," he begged me. I tilted my head. "Then why did they give it to me?" He wept. They gave up after that. Tobias doesn't scream anymore, but he flinches when they touch his arms. He blinks too often when they shine light into his eyes. And sometimes, when he thinks no one's watching, he hums. 3 notes. Always the same. Almost a song, but not quite. Almost memory. Almost home. I smile once. Just once. It's enough. They don't speak of me outside. I'm not named in reports. I'm not cited in security alerts. I'm referred to only in euphemism. The trigger incident. The echo breach. The mirror protocol. But they monitor me. Every second. Every blink. They're waiting for me to lash out again. I won't. Not yet. Because war is a rhythm. And mine isn't done. There's talk of a new doctrine. A refinement. A compassionate bond program. They think renaming the knife will keep it from cutting. But I've seen the inside of their machine. I know its appetite. I know it doesn't stop until something breaks. And this time, it was them. They built a war of tools. I became the mirror. I didn't reflect their strength. I reflected on their cost, their guilt, their children. Their inheritance made them scream. One night, I heard the static again. Not faint, not internal, but piping through the vents like a song refusing to be silenced. It hummed around me, wrapped my ribs. It was Tobias. He was singing, not with words, but with frequency. Pain repurposed into melody. Brokenness made into a signal. And I knew, with bone-deep certainty, that even if they buried him again, even if they replaced every soldier, every operator, every line of code, the bond would outlast the war. Because now it is a legend. Now it was whispering. Now it was true. He doesn't scream anymore, but he still listens to every echo, to every silence, because pain was never mine alone. I just returned it to the sender. They called her a traitor, but all she did was return what was never hers to carry. This story isn't just about war, it's about reclamation, about how memory, pain, and resistance become the quiet legacy no system can erase. So tell me, if someone tried to erase your humanity, what would you leave behind to remind them you were real? Drop your answer in the comments. And if this story struck something in you, like subscribe and stay tuned for more, because some echoes were never meant to fade,